Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. This is one of the series of lectures on heart failure. Now, the heart failure can be uh, seen as acute heart failure, and then it's a chronic congestive heart failure. Or we'll be covering it in two lectures. The today's lecture is primarily managing and diagnosing acute heart failure. Now, we'll go in a fashion like a case scenario, and then based on the case scenario we'll be talking about questions and then how to investigate it. So you are on duty in emergency room, and you are managing a 62-year-old man. He was brought in the emergency because of severe sudden onset of shortness of his breath or dyspnea. And when you arrived on the scene, you found him sitting in the bed, leaning forward, with supporting his arms on the chair back, and looking distressed. He's pale, sweaty, coughing. He's producing out pinkish, frothy sputum. And then, of course, you would like to have a brief history. You ask few questions, but you found that he's too dyspneic and too distressed to be answered. So you change your approach, and you first focus on his immediate management. And but still, the information provided by the attendant is that he suffered an acute myocardial infarction 6 months ago. You observe that he has xanthelasma. His pulse rate was around 140 beats per minute. He was breathing at a rate of around 30 breaths per minute. His oxygen saturation was 85%. His blood pressure was 180 or 90 millimeter mercury. And you auscultated bilateral basal crepitations, and there was a third sound gallop audible in on cardiac auscultation, and he was having bilateral pedal edema. Now you stop, and then you start thinking that what is the cause of this patient's respiratory distress. Do you think that the examination is sufficient enough to make a diagnosis, or you need some few further additional investigations? And of course, whether his breathlessness is because of heart, or is it is because of some respiratory causes. And when you examined, you notice a few things, and these hint towards a possible cause or not. Now, when talking of someone who is acutely short of breath or dyspneic, and which means that he was all right a moment ago, and suddenly he became severely short of breath. Now, this, first of all, must raise something that he might not have aspirated or choked, or it might have led on to foreign body airway obstruction, like someone while on in the restaurant while eating becomes acutely dyspneic. Sometime an acute, say, leak of air into the pleural cavity and pneumothorax, sudden onset, and that too, a tension pneumothorax would make you dyspneic within seconds. An anaphylactic reaction to a drug, to allergen, to something, or a sting bite may even be responsible for one of the component of anaphylaxis apart from hypotension, maybe severe breathlessness or dyspnea. Someone who has an acute arrhythmia, like in the form of a ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation, would rapidly decrease cardiac compromise and would lead on to acute sound dyspnea. Those which are put in red, they are some of the conditions which need an immediate correction there and then, without even that should be possibly reflexly thought of and then immediately approached in a very vigilant manner. Next on line is that someone who has dyspnea which developed over few hours to maybe few say minutes. This can be development of acute pulmonary edema. It can be a manifestation of an acute coronary syndrome in the form of acute myocardial infarction, or maybe, if not acute myocardial infarction, may be sufficient enough to cause myocardial contractility problems and may present with dyspnea. Sometimes asthmatic patients with an acute exacerbation do present with worsening dyspnea, and acute respiratory infections, rapidly progressive pneumonias can lead on to dyspnea developing over hours or maybe few days. And similarly, those patients who are already have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, they may have an acute exacerbation, and they may have worsening of their baseline dyspnea, or they may have worsening which has been there over few hours or maybe few days. Now, when you see a patient who is dyspneic in the emergency room, who is presented with a short history of breathlessness of a few hours or maybe 1 or 2 days, you think your goals are that you try to identify the pathologies which might be leading to pulmonary edema. If it is pulmonary edema, what is causing that pulmonary edema? What are the factors which in the history can help you in make a diagnosis? What are the things which on examination can help you in making a diagnosis? Do we need to get a chest x-ray? And if chest x-ray you do get it, what are the findings which you're looking for? Are there some other investigations which would be helpful, and how this patient should be managed? So these are the objective of our today's presentation, that we learn all these things. Now, before we go on to manage, we have to have some basic things, that what are the things which are responsible for causing acute dyspnea, in particularly in a cardiovascular background. Now, this is the very familiar diagram of the alveolar capillary bed, and the one single alveolus being shown. So if you notice, just follow this say arrow. Now this is the alveolar membrane, alveolar cavity, sorry, and this is the what is we call an alveolar membrane, right, with all its the cell linings and all that. This is the interstitial space, and this is the capillary, where you have the capillary blood flowing from one side to the other, and then this is how. Now the blood flowing through here, this leads on to some fluid being transuded out into this space, and this fluid is then taken up by the lymphatics and keep this space clear for a gas exchange. But sometime it may be the pressure may be so much that this fluid is not taken up by the drained by the lymphatics and accumulates, and this leads on to interstitial edema. Some of it may leak into the alveolus, and when it reaches the alveoli, this would then lead on to alveolar, say, being say, flooded by the blood, this fluid, and this is what we call as a pulmonary edema, right? Now, the shift of fluid from here to here is dependent upon, it may be because of a very high back pressure in the alveolar capillaries, or hydrostatic pressure. There are things which keep the fluid inside the vessel, which is called the oncotic pressure, and low oncotic pressure can lead on to leak of fluid into here. And similarly, there may be something wrong in the this alveolar capillary membrane, or alveoli themselves, that fluid shifts from here, or the capillaries become leaky and fluid flow into here and then over here, right? So there can be sometimes peribronchial edema or interstitial edema, what we call this. There can be fluid in the interstitium, and then there can be fluid coming into the alveoli. Now, so there are three factors which need consideration: the capillary hydrostatic pressure, the capillary oncotic pressure, and the capillary alveolar permeability, right? And each one of them can lead on to leakage of fluid into the either into the interstitium or into the alveoli themselves, or which we call as pulmonary edema. Now, increased capillary hydrostatic pressure would lead on to development of pulmonary edema. A decrease in capillary oncotic pressure, like low protein, loss of protein through either kidney leakage or proteinuria, or maybe decreased production from the liver can be responsible for that. And then there is increased capillary alveolar permeability, which could be because of the acute inflammatory response into the lungs. So the heart will act on the first two factors, right? The third factor is because of the causes in the lungs, or what we call as a non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema, or we also name it at adult respiratory distress syndrome as well. So the pulmonary edema is either cardiogenic or non-cardiogenic. Cardiogenic because of increased back pressure or increased hydrostatic capillary pressure, and non-cardiogenic because of decreased oncotic pressure, or maybe because of increased leakage of the capillaries because of the inflammatory markers. And the cardiogenic pulmonary edema can result from an acute complication of myocardial infarction, or as a long-standing manifestation of ischemic heart disease with the myocardium losing its ability to pump, or maybe called as ischemic cardiomyopathy. It can be the exacerbation of an underlying heart failure, which we will be discussing in next lecture. Sometimes arrhythmias lead on to a decreased cardiac output and decreased pumping by the heart, like the onset of atrial fibrillation or onset of a ventricular tachycardia may lead on to failed ability of the heart to of the atria to push blood forward, or maybe ventricle to contract rhythmically to have a effective cardiac output, and this results in a back pressure being built into the left atrium pulmonary venous circuit and then into the interstitial leakage of the fluid. Some people might have had undergone and say previous surgery, and they have prosthetic valve, and this prosthetic valve may malfunction. Sometimes congenital lesions like ventricular septal defect or an atrial septal defect leads on to say overload, and then development of pulmonary hypertension, and then of course sometimes even reversal of the shunt converter. Primary heart muscle disease like cardiomyopathies we discussed in previous lecture. Say addition of a beta blocker into in someone's say treatment where the heart is dependent primarily on sympathomimetic drive for its function can sometimes worsen. Acute myocarditis can be a reason, and sometimes pericardial disease can a contributory factor to heart failure, although that would the primary cause would be pericardial, not the myocardial. The non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema, the most common example is adult respiratory distress syndrome because of the in severe sepsis or severe say head injuries, there is an increased capillary leak. Sometimes it can be because of fluid overload, like in patient with renal failure who cannot get rid of fluid, or given extra fluid, or the heart which cannot pump properly. Hyperbilinemia we already described, leads on to decreased oncotic pressure, certain medications like addition of beta blockers, certain poisons like cardiotoxic drugs, or chemical inhalation like ammonia may be responsible for development of cardiogenic, non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. Sometimes it can be lymphatics being say involved in carcinomatous process, and so the normal fluid which usually leaks into the interstitial spaces and is taken away by the lymphatics is not drained, and patient develops pulmonary edema or interstitial edema. Smoke inhalation or drowning, of course, would lead on to alveoli being filled with the fluid, and this the say low oncotic pressure or lack of surfactant would cause pulmonary non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. And in high altitude mountain sickness can also be one of the manifestation. Those who are this mountaineers, they, and if they are not acclimatized to the situation, they would develop that when they go say scaling a peak, or going for say on high altitude. So it's important that we are able to differentiate between cardiogenic pulmonary edema and non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. Patient with non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema have a warm periphery, a bounding pulse, there is no third sound gallop, the JVP is not distended because the heart as a pump is okay. It is the lung which is leaky, or the capillaries in the lung which are leaky. The definite differentiation can be based on, as we previously sometime discussed, on the capillary wedge pressure. So a failing heart would have increased capillary wedge pressure, whereas the lung, if they are cause of pulmonary edema, the capillary wedge pressure would be normal. So it's the customary to take a cutoff value of 18. So someone with, if you have invasive monitoring and you do record their capillary wedge pressure, if it is more than 18, it suggests a heart as a cause of pulmonary edema. But if it is less than 18, it is usually maybe because of the non-cardiac causes. But sometimes there is an overlap. You may have a patient who has say COPD and who developed an acute myocardial infarction as well, and or cardiac muscle disease for some other reason, or myocarditis for that matter. And in this situation, it would be difficult to differentiate between whether this is because of say primarily cardiac or because of the lung causes. So in when you start say examining your patient, usually if there is there if not in very acute severe distress, you first try to reach for a cause from a history. It is important, and sometimes it is very important, that you search for the main symptoms, usually which are dyspnea, patient are anxious, they may have a pallor as a result of marked vasoconstriction of a compensatory mechanism, or there may be an anemia which may be contributing to their heart failure. They may have a lot of sweating because of increased sympathetic drive and sympathetic activity. They usually would not be able to lie flat, or they would having orthopnea. And sometimes there may be a productive cough, and this productive cough may not always being because of chest infection. Some degree of say fluid into the alveoli would lead on to some pinkish frothy sputum, and they may be producing maybe having slight mild hemoptysis even, or maybe what is they may be producing a pinkish frothy sputum because of that, and they may be calling it as a productive cough. Or sometime the acute infection or bronchitis or pneumonia is the contributory factor towards their heart failure. So, of course, you want to know about the previous history of ischemic heart disease or failure, or recent respiratory infection in the form of, say, increased sputum production or fever, or any chest pain which may be pleuritic or maybe cardiac or pericardial in nature. So that's important to know about, all about that. Sometime they might have undergone a recent surgery, or maybe given a lot of fluid, and fluid overload will be responsible. Sometime they might be post-operative patients of valve replacement or surgeries. And of course, you also think of medication which might lead on to myocardial, say, contractility being compromised, leading on to, say, decreased pump function of the heart, and this may be the contributory factor, and maybe that's what you need to treat. On examination, you find these patients, they might be having definitely they would have tachypnea or increased say breathing rate, tachycardia, sometime bradycardia may also be there. They are anxious. In severe cases, they may be cyanosed, not primarily because of the lung, but maybe because of the marked peripheral vasoconstriction, and the hemoglobin in the periphery getting juiced up, the oxygen being used up, and the patient becoming cyanotic. They may be, as we discussed, coughing up pinky frothy sputum. They would have difficulty in talking or completing a sentence, and you carefully auscultate their chest, particularly the heart, for any murmurs, systolic or diastolic, depending upon some underlying valvular involvement or heart dilatation. They may have a third or fourth heart sound. You do examine for any crepitation in their lung bases, They may be limited to the bases, or they may be widespread like in pulmonary edema. With an additional component of right heart failure adding on, there may be an elevated jugular venous pressure. They may also have ankle edema and signs of of right heart failure, and they may be sweating, and they may have pallor. So these are the things which you specifically look for when you examine them. When you start investigation, your treatment usually is based on clinical suspicion before even completing all the investigations. So the first thing you need to do is that check their oxygen saturation, and if need arise, you of course give them supplemental oxygen. Attaching them to a cardiac monitor and monitoring their cardiac rhythm throughout their say management, as well as looking for any signs of say fresh ischemia or fresh infarct or fresh arrhythmia is always important. Try to get a chest x-ray if possible by the bedside or point of care chest x-ray. Get a 12 lead ECG. Send this blood for uh, electrolytes, glucose, urea and creatinine, complete blood count. Troponins would be important to rule out that they may not be suffering an acute myocardial infarction. And if their oxygen saturation is less than 94, do get arterial blood gases, which cause that would help us in defining that patient is primarily having just a type 1 type respiratory failure or hypoxemic say picture only, or they do have a CO2 retention, which may favor more of a respiratory say origin or respiratory contribution to their heart failure. If possible, try to get a previous ECG, try to get a previous notes or medical record if available. When you get a chest x-ray in failing heart, which is not been able to pump forward, there would be the backward pressure into the say pulmonary venous system, and this would make it congested, and when you in a sitting position, the lowermost portion get the maximum congestion, and that is the portion which is definitely more aerated, uh, more say having blood supply but less aeration. So to get a better say uh, oxygen exchange, the nature diverts the blood to the upper side, and so you would see the upper lobe blood vessels being more prominent. Heart size may be enlarged. There may be curly A and B lines which suggest dilated lymphatics in an attempt to take fluid away from the interstitial space. You may notice fluid in the interlobar fissure, particularly on the right side. The transverse fissure becomes more prominent because of say fluid coming there, and at a later stage there may be development of pleural effusion, and sometimes you can have bat wing hilar shadows, which suggest congestion spreading from the hilar region to the periphery in the lungs. This is mnemonic to remember that what you have to look for in a patient with a failing heart on a chest x-ray. So it is A, B, C, D. A is for alveolar edema, which appears like a bat wing appearance, which is like wings of a bat spreading out from the hilar region towards the periphery. Curly B lines, they are on the costophrenic angle straight white lines we see because of these uh, lymphatic being prominent. Heart size may be enlarged cardiomegaly, dilated upper lobe vessels, and then effusion. So this is what do you expect in a patient on chest x-ray and who is in heart failure or in acute pulmonary edema. This is the picture you look for again. So this is what you call the upper lobe veins being prominent. This is the hilar congestion and not classical bat wings. This is again a transverse fissure becoming outlined. This denotes that the overall heart size is more than 50% of the total lung. You do see the obliteration of the costophrenic angles on both sides, suggesting pleural effusions, right? And of course, you can also notice a more prominent aortic knuckle on this chest X-ray. Now, these are the things which you expect in a patient with pulmonary edema or heart failure. Now, with this done, we did mention that you may have sometime um, confusion between that whether this patient's dyspnea is cardiogenic or non-cardiogenic. Although there are points which we did mention that which help you and make a diagnosis, but sometime so in such situation you have to take help of some other additional investigations. So the question is that which laboratory investigation would help you in differentiating between cardiogenic versus non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. Now, this is the answer that B-type atrial natriuretic peptide, which is released as a result of a atrial stretch of a failing heart or as a result of back pressure, and this peptide is in an attempt to get rid of sodium from the body, so it leads to more of a sodium being lost, and of course sodium along with its water from the kidneys. So this leads on to some reduction of say preload, and would lead on to, so it's a sort of an protective response or an adaptive response on part of the heart to get rid of say some extra fluid by way of natriuresis, and this elevation of BNP on blood testing suggests that the cause is of pulmonary edema or heart failure is cardiac. So in failing heart, this stretch reduces ANP, which to get rid of sodium from the kidneys and hence get rid of water along with it. When you treat this heart failure or acute pulmonary edema, there are three basic principles of treatment of cardiogenic pulmonary edema. First and foremost is that you tend to reduce pulmonary venous return or reduce the preload. The second is that you reduce the systemic vascular resistance or the afterload. So the heart is in the center, it receives blood from the periphery and then it pumps against a certain pressure, and then the inside is the pump. So the heart failure can be because of increased preload, so you try to reduce that by reducing the preload. The pump in center may fail, and so you may use some inotropic agents to increase the myocardial contractility, and then the pressure against which the heart pumps, if you reduce that pressure, heart would have to exert less, so you reduce afterload. So the three areas where you can say work is the one reducing the preload, trying or attempting to increase the myocardial contractility by inotropic support, and reducing the afterload. So the patient with severe left ventricular dysfunction or acute valvular disorders may also be hypotensive. Now, these patients at times may not tolerate all those measures which were described, that by further reducing the pressure may be detrimental, or further lowering their preload may be detrimental. So therefore, these patients probably would be requiring more of an inotropic support to maintain an adequate blood pressure, rather than getting say diuretics alone, or maybe say vasodilators alone. You can reduce the preload by using agents like nitroglycerin, which is a venodilator, by diuretics, which get rid of an extra fluid. Morphine not only relieves the anxiety and reduces sympathetic overexcitability, but also relieves pain and also reduces preload. And same is done by the agent called as nesiretride. The afterload can be reduced by use of vasodilators, and the more effective one are the angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, or those who have a lot of cough as a result of this ACE inhibitors, which is one of the side effects or one of the major untoward effect. Those can be given angiotensin II receptor blockers. Nitroprusside again is a very potent vasodilator, and sometimes it has to be used. And similarly, phosphodiesterase inhibitors or sometimes theophylline derivatives, they also help in reducing the afterload. The inotropic support is usually from the sympathomimetic agents, beta 2 agonists like dobutamine, like dopamine, like norepinephrine, and then phosphodiesterase inhibitors also have some inotropic effect, and sometimes calcium sensitizers can be given, which do improve the myocardial contractility. Ventilatory support primarily is thought of that it is possibly helpful in patient with non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema alone, but not. It is helpful in say cardiogenic pulmonary edema as well. So non-invasive pressure support, ventilatory support would give say lead on to pushing of fluid from the alveoli back into the interstitium and then be taken away by the lymphatics or diuretics. So mechanical ventilation does have a role in management of refractory pulmonary edema or refractory heart failure. So in summary, you go for say initial assessment of the urgency of the situation. You check for the airway, breathing, and circulation, and then the first thing is that you have to have a redistribution of fluid out of the lung. So the first line treatment is nitrates. Second line is adding ACE inhibitors. Third line is diuretics, and of course consider of non-invasive positive pressure ventilation, and don't delay it. Uh, don't wait for that the patient is on verge of collapse. So considering early addition of this non-invasive positive pressure ventilation in the form of CPAP or in the form of BiPAP is always helpful, and sometimes they may require say invasive ventilation after intubation. Milrinone is another agent which is an inotropic agent and can be helpful. So there's a mnemonic by the name of LMNOP. This is just as you remember your alphabets in English. So L stands for Lasix, which is a diuretic. M stands for morphine, which we already described as both preload reducing agents, apprehension reducing agents, pain reliever, and may lead on to some sympathetic drive being taken away. Nitrates again are primarily venodilator, reduce the preload. Oxygen, giving high flow oxygen definitely leads on to say better gas exchange, and it is helpful. And of course these patients, as we said, are unable to lie flat, but in fact on lying flat their say ventilation perfusion mismatching takes place, and so they are better say to be managed in a sitting position or an upright position, or with at least 2 or 3 pillows. So this is the summary that you should place your patient in a sitting position. You should give them high flow oxygen by face mask or by nasal cannula. Give at least 50 to 100 milligram of furosemide or diuretics. You give a small dose of opioid morphine. But of course, be careful that if your patient is already drowsy, confused, exhausted, or has a low respiratory rate, don't give morphine because it would lead on to respiratory depression. Give nitroglycerin. This can be given as a sublingual preparation and then can be started on a continuous infusion form in the intravenous form as well. Dopamine may be needed to augment the cardiac function, particularly those who are hypotension. Now, these patients are quite sick. They have low blood pressure. They have decreased renal perfusion. They are unable to move out of bed, and you want to monitor their urine output as well, because one of the say objective of managing these patients is to maintain their blood pressure to an extent that it maintains vital organ perfusion, and the most vital organ is one of the vital organ is of course the kidney, because if the kidney doesn't get its due share of perfusion, it would lead on to fluid being retained, and patient may developing oliguria or anuria, or may develop renal failure. To this type of renal failure, we usually use the term cardiorenal syndrome or cardiorenal failure. So, since there is one of the objective is to maintain an adequate urine output of at least 30 ml per hour, so it is better that you say pass a Foley's catheter and record their urine output every hour or maybe every 30 minutes in some, because by the time urea and creatinine are gone up, you have already had say acute kidney injury or acute renal failure. uh, Treat the underlying cause. It can be arrhythmia, like if patient is having atrial fibrillation, you might need to have digoxin or cardaron being administered. If they are having recent MI, you follow the protocol of myocardial infarction depending upon whether it is an ST elevation myocardial infarction or non-ST elevation. If they are in cardiogenic shock, they would require inotropic support, and you look for the cause of cardiogenic shock. If arrhythmia, you do the needful, and if it is other contributory factor, you do treat them as well. Sometime there may be, as we said, post-surgical patients or those who had undergone cardiac surgery, so acute prostatic valve failure may be responsible. So the important thing is that after initial evaluation and early management in the emergency room or in the high dependency unit, they should be transferred to intensive care unit, where a continuous monitoring of their uh, vital signs, as well as ECG, as well as urine output and blood pressure, that is maintained and recorded, and if an early intervention is required, it is decided there and then. So with this background, we'll now discuss three more cases, right? And the assignment for you people is that you will uh, report, say, the answers, or write your answers and send it through email after going through these cases, and then the questions which are asked at the end of each case. So our first case is a 55-year-old male who is presented with 3 hours history of chest pain. His ECG shows ST elevation in the limb leads 1, AVL, and leads V4 to V6 on the chest leads. His CPK, MB, and troponin I were elevated. So you can guess what is happening to this gentleman. So what's the diagnosis, right? It is an acute lateral wall ST elevation myocardial infarction. A patient presenting within 3 hours of onset of chest pain, and we have discussed time and again that how should he manage the protocol for an ST elevation MI presenting within 3 hours of onset. What would be the best option for him? So how will you manage? The immediate management of acute coronary syndrome or acute myocardial infarction has been, say, to remember, we call it mnemonic in the form of MONA, right? So M stands for morphine, O stands for oxygen, N stands for nitrates, and A for aspirin. So you give them intravenous morphine for pain relief, you attach oxygen and give it 3 to 4 liters per minute. You give sublingual nitrates, or you may start on intravenous nitrate infusion if they are not hypotensive, and you give an aspirin to chew. So this is the first thing, or which should be done in a patient who presents with an recent onset chest pain diagnosed as acute myocardial infarction or acute coronary syndrome. So this gentleman, our case number one, he received morphine, oxygen nitrate, and aspirin, 10 milligram of intravenous morphine, oxygen inhalation at 2 liters per minute, aspirin and sublingual nitrates. And then, since he was around 3 hours after the onset of pain, was a bit late for primary angioplasty, or so that was he was given thrombolysis. Streptokinase 1.5 million units was given over 1 hour, and 30 minutes later, the duty nurse reported that there were multiple ventricular premature contraction on ECG monitors. He also had a short run of ventricular tachycardia observed by the resident on duty, and but his blood pressure remained stable. Now the questions was that what is the likely cause of his arrhythmia? So 24 hours later, he complained of breathlessness with difficulty in lying flat. His pulse at that time was 110 beats per minute. His blood pressure was 100 over 70 million mercury. A third sound gallop and a systolic murmur at the apex were noted, which were not there previously. And the doctor on duty noticed that he has developed fine crepitations up to his mid chest. So, what complication has he developed, and how should he be managed now? So, this is a setting of acute myocardial infarction within 24 hours of onset of his symptoms or reporting to hospital. So you have to write down that how would you further manage this gentleman. Our second case is a 27-year-old lady. She is 8 months pregnant and has started developing breathlessness for the past 3 weeks, progressing to NYHA class 3. She is normotensive. There is no past medical history of any suggestion of a rheumatic fever, and there is no history of diabetes mellitus, and there is no proteinuria. Her pulse is 100 beats per minute, regular, low volume, and it has an alternance character. His blood pressure is 100 over 70. JVP was raised 8 centimeter and with a normal wave pattern. But her apex beat was displaced to 6 intercostal space outside midclavicular line, and it was ill-sustained heave. There was a faint first sound. There was prominent S3 gallop, and grade 3/6 systolic murmur was audible at the apex, which had no radiation, but it was definitely prominent during expiration. There were bilateral crepitations up to the mid-chest, and her right hypochondrium was tender, and there was marked pitting edema. Now this is a young lady who is pregnant, 8 months, and has feature of biventricular failure. So we probably have to talk about what is the diagnosis. What would be the differential diagnosis in such case? There will be alternative diagnosis which should be considered. What investigations and diagnostic procedures would be done in this case, and how this lady should be managed now. And what is the prognosis of this condition? Again, these are the things which we have already discussed in previous 2 lectures, and you should take help from those 2 lectures as well to answer all these questions. Our third case is a 65-year-old retired teacher who presents in the emergency room with severe dyspnea for the last 3 or 4 days. He has been running fever for 5 days. He is diabetic. He is known hypertensive. He takes his medication regularly. But there is a history that 10 years ago he suffered an myocardial infarction. 5 years ago he underwent coronary artery bypass grafting, and he also has benign prostatic hypertrophy and has burning micturition for a few days. He has stopped his medication for last 1 week. Now there are so many factors which possibly looks like to be contributing to this gentleman's dyspnea. So on examination, he is unable to lie flat. He has marked pallor. His temperature is 101. His pulse is 110 per minute. It's irregular. His blood pressure is 160 over 110. Sorry. Is JVP is raised and a 3 by 6 pansystolic murmur at the apex is audible. There are bilateral crepitations heard all over his chest. Now, what is the diagnosis in this case? What are the precipitating factors which led on to dyspnea? There are quite a few which are evident on history. What investigations will help to confirm the diagnosis? How should he be managed in the emergency room? Right. So this is what we call as acute heart failure. The essential of diagnosis or salient diagnostic features of acute heart failure are usually that the patient presents with fatigue and shortness of breath. They do have difficulty in lying flat or orthopnea. They do complain of sometimes their dyspnea worsening in the midnight, or they getting sitting up or waking up from the sleep with extreme shortness of breath, to which we call as paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea. Sometimes they may have a chain stroke breathing, which means that apnea and hyperapnea alternating. Again, one of the causes of chain stroke breathing is heart failure. So they may be having bilateral crepitations, full of the chest full of crepitations up to the maybe mid chest or above, and sometimes because of hypotension or decreased cerebral perfusion, they may be confused and disoriented, particularly the elderly one. So in such cases, what do you look for? This is what we call as a physical signs. So you look for signs of respiratory distress. Of course, they are visible. They may be using accessory respiratory muscles. Again, that is possible in both heart failure as well as in COPD. Their skin may be cold and clammy, and they may be having a lot of sweating. They may have peripheral cyanosis, as already explained, because of the severe vasoconstriction compensatory. Depending upon that, primarily it's a left heart alone, or right heart also is failing. They may have elevated jugular venous pressure. They may be tachycardic, or sometimes may have an irregular pulse. Sometimes they are both, can be hypertensive or hypertension, or acute exacerbation of hypertension leading on to worsening their failure. And on the other hand, sometimes they may be extremely hypotensive because of a pump failure. There may be an audible third sound gallop, and you can auscultate crackles in the lungs, and sometimes there may be congestive hepatomegaly, and there may be pedal edema. So these are all the signs which you have to look for in support of your assumption that the patient is having heart failure. You do consider that whether it is just the heart failure, or it can be something else as well. So think of cardiogenic causes. It can be acute myocardial infarction, ischemia, underlying valvular disease, or cardiomyopathy, hypertensive emergency syndrome, or sometimes it may be what is called the cardiorenal syndrome. In non-cardiogenic causes, you think of sepsis, adult respiratory distress syndrome, or any other cause of shock or a septic shock. You think of toxin in dogs, or drugs, and neurogenic aspiration, or you do think of fat embolism in someone who has polytrauma or fracture of the large, say, bones. What investigation should be immediately carried out? Of course, the ECG is the mainstay to look for any fresh ischemia, infarction, arrhythmia, or any chamber hypertrophy. Chest X-ray, as already explained. Arterial blood gases would help you looking for hypoxia or hypercapnia. Complete blood count and hemoglobin. Sometime anemia may be the contributory factor, or there may be a lot of leukocytosis suggesting an infective cause of worsening of their symptoms. They may have electrolyte disturbances, particularly if they are in, say, renal failure, or there may be some drugs which they may be taking, which can both cause hypokalemia or hyperkalemia. Even sometime angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors are a contributory factor towards electrolyte disturbances. So this is important to note that any pre-existing electrolyte abnormality, and similarly you want to monitor that once you give them medication, like you prescribe them with the Lasix or furosemide, it may lead on to hypokalemia, or you prescribe spironolactone, which may lead on to hyperkalemia. Knowing the renal function test is important. They may already be in having renal perfusion problems leading on to acute kidney injury and acute renal failure, or during the course of their management or course of their illness, they can develop that. BNP we described as a sensitive marker for congestive heart failure, and when in doubt that whether patient symptoms are because of heart failure or because of respiratory problem, you do get this investigation done. Then, after considering these investigations, you do medical treatment or interventions. So, in all patients with congestive heart failure, you should take an IV access or take an passive IV cannula or branula and make an access with to administer drugs, and maybe sometime it may be later on required. Sometime you might have to put on a central venous line because IVXS either is not available, and some more importantly, that putting in a central venous line would help you in monitoring their central venous pressure. So those who are having failing heart would have an elevated CVP pressure or central venous pressure, and those who are hypotensive because of other reasons, or are in shock because of hypovolemia or sepsis, they may have reduced or low central venous pressure. Give them oxygen by face mask, attach them to a cardiac monitor to monitor their pulse, oxygen saturation by pulse oximetry. Give them intravenous furosemide, something around 50 to 100 milligram intravenous bolus. Sometime you might have to set up an intravenous infusion later on. Give them nitrates intravenously for reducing their preloads. Give them morphine intravenously, again for preload reduction and relieving their anxiety and pain. Sometime you have to, if your patient is having some arrhythmias, so you do consider if they are already on digoxin may be a contributory factor towards their worsening because of the digoxin induced arrhythmias. So check their digoxin level if they are already on it. Check their electrolytes, we already mentioned potassium and magnesium, which may be contributing to the arrhythmias. Preferably in patient of acute heart failure, it is better to give amiodarone for atrial fibrillation, and if there are ventricular arrhythmias, they also would be taken care of by amiodarone. Those who are in cardiogenic shock or hypotensive, you do all of the things already mentioned above, but there you possibly pass in an endotracheal tube and give them dopamine for inotropic support, or dobutamine, particularly if there is an acute myocardial infarction. You do consider things like devices like intra-aortic balloon counterpulsations for patient with cardiogenic shock. If during the course of your initial investigation you find that there is an acute say myocardial infarction, ST elevation, MI, and they have presented in a cardiogenic shock, you do consider thrombolysis, and of course you may have to take them to cath lab for a possible coronary angioplasty if the situation demands or if the facilities are also available. These patients can develop complication during course of their management. So the first is that they may be severely hypoxemic, and they may have both acidosis as a result of anaerobic say ventilation, and they may be also having acidosis if they develop acute renal failure during course of their illness because of poor kidney perfusion. So you look for evidence of end organ hypertrophy, as we suggested that you record their urine output preferably every hour. They may develop change in mental status and because become confused, become oliguric, and they may have cool clammy skin. If their blood pressure is less than 90 mm mercury, it means that they are possibly going into cardiogenic shock. If their partial oxygen is less than 60 despite 100 oxygen face mask, that is an indication for ventilation. A rising PCO2 is again would be an indication that this patient now need to be attached to ventilator after passing in an endotracheal tube, and worsening acidosis again would be an indication that the patient is getting complications. You should not miss the underlying precipitating reversible factors, if any, because it is acute management is for heart failure, but you have to look for what led on to this, and if it is reversible, do reverse it. So look for possible ischemia or new infarct or acute coronary syndrome, and of course do the needful. You, as we described, thrombolyze if required, angioplasty if required, or the management of acute coronary syndrome as we have discussed previously as well. Look for an arrhythmia, particularly new onset atrial fibrillation can be the contributing factor, and just say correcting that rhythm or reducing the ventricular rate by agents like digoxin or by agents like amiodarone can be quite fruitful. If they have accelerated hypertension, lowering their blood pressure, of course, would be beneficial, and you can manage them well by reducing the pressure. You find an evidence of infection, and that is the major reason which precipitated. So treat that infection. It may be in the lungs or in the form of pneumonia, and sometime in the elderly, it is a UTI, urinary tract infection, which may have manifestation, which may not have manifestation at all. Sometimes it's anemia alone. They are having hemoglobin running around 7, 8, and they may not be having an obvious overt blood loss. There may be having occult blood loss in the form of from the GI or somewhere or genitourinary, and sometimes they may be having um, definite bleeding per rectum or hematuria, and this anemia is the factor which precipitated their dyspnea. So if you correct anemia by giving them a packed cell blood transfusion, that may be the only thing required. Sometimes they may be missing their medications. They are prescribed with agents and they don't take it, right. Sometimes they may be having fluid overload. These patients, particularly the those who are in chronic congestive cardiac failure, are advised to take less salt to reduce water intake, right? Or they may be having an underlying acute kidney injury on top of say underlying, so they don't comply with the dietary instructions. They take a lot of salt or water, lead on to fluid overload, heart is unable to pump, and they get their dyspnea precipitated. Now this is a diagram which I hope that you can see, that you observe someone who is drowning into the fluid and is need to be saved. So drowning in a patient who is in acute pulmonary edema, just imagine that you are sinking into a deep sea. You are alone. You are surrounded by the darkness. Your heart is beating at fast pace. Laborious breathing, effortlessly and with pain, feeling the end is near. Your hands looking pale. You're trembling from fear. You are too breathless to speak or to shout for help, when suddenly someone throws a life jacket to that drowning patient, and he get hold of that and comes out of that sea. This is what you do in patient who are in acute pulmonary edema. Your management is throwing a life jacket to someone who was about to drown in his own secretions. Thank you very much, and I will write down these assignment again, but it is primarily has to be based on the three case scenarios which are in the this presentation, and it would also make sure that you had say attended or say listen to this presentation very carefully. Thank you very much.